class. To just give you a little information about the website and how you can use it. Many of you have already used the opportunity to get on our kind of interactive part and have been sending us wonderful notes about the course or different ideas. But I want to give you already a preview of coming attractions about next semester. Next semester we'll be meeting at the same time, 6 o'clock, but on Wednesday nights rather than Thursday, starting the first week in January. And you should already be marking your calendars, because if you like this, and I think you'll like even more what's coming up the rest of the semester, you are going to be in heaven over next semester's program that we just started designing now. The name of the open classroom course for next semester is called Globalization, that's the title. Everybody talks about globalization. Everybody talks about the world getting smaller. Everybody talks about the world getting flatter. What do we mean by it? How has globalization affected society? Joining me next semester will be our brand new colleague, Bill Dickens, who is an economist who has written extensively, by the way, with other Nobel laureates. Spent much of his time at Berkeley as a professor there. Brookings Institution, was on the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bill Clinton, and joins us now as a full-time faculty member and professor of public policy and economics in our school in the economics department. Bill will be joining me along with Carla Kaplan, who is the director of our Humanities Center, because we will also be initiating at the university this year a new structure in which this College of Arts and Sciences, which is this huge college with almost half the students in it, will be broken up into 3 smaller colleges, and one of those will be the College of Social Science and the Humanities. And within it will be the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And Carla will be very important in terms of what we're doing in humanities, and our school will be important in terms of what we do in social science. How do we put them together? Globalization, And the way we look at it now, although we haven't worked out all the details, we will be focusing on 3 different major subjects having to do with globalization. Topic 1, economics. We've got 2 economists here, and we're going to talk about what does globalization mean for the economy, what does it mean in terms of our standard of living here, in other countries in the third world, good or bad. We've just started an international G20 summit, and we've got thousands of people in Pittsburgh protesting. The people are coming there because they see globalization as dangerous for small people, children, and other things. Well, what is the impact of globalization? We'll be looking at issues like trade, north-south, east-west. We'll be looking at questions of trade protection. We'll be looking at whether, in fact, trade really does improve people's standard of living, or whether, in some cases, it harms it. Second major topic will be national and international security. What does globalization mean in terms of how secure we are in terms of violence, in terms of war? We are no longer, it appears to be, an era of huge world wars like World War I or World War II, or going back even further, the War of the Roses. But we seem to have conflicts all over the world. To what extent is that due to globalization? What does it mean? We're going to have some extraordinary, brilliant people joining us for that. And then the third part of this new course in the spring will be on the whole question of culture. What does globalization mean for the novel? What does it mean for music? What does it mean for poetry, for theater, for art? Does it mean anything at all? Have we always had globalized culture, or has it changed? So I cannot wait to be part of this, only because I am so excited about some of the people we're talking about joining us in what can be an extraordinary new adventure in the open classroom. Before going through today's seminar, which is a continuation of last week's, but looking at some of the basics of why cities exist in the first place, I want to introduce John Sarve to you, who, as I said, brings the open classroom to you, so he can give you a little idea of the website that we hope you're looking at quite often, and indeed participating in this class in still another way. John.
Get prepared with that. How many of you have read the email that I sent last night? All right, pretty good. And how many of you have been on the website to access stuff? Okay. We thought we'd take just a couple minutes and browse around here in case you haven't been on it to show you what's here. It's an improvement over the spring. So as you can see here, if you go to our website and then click on this button, this thing right here, you get to this page. You can download the syllabus. Here's some basic information. There's the RSVP thing, which many of you have done. And then we've got these links here. This RSVP just sends you further down the page. The course schedule, we've got a version of it that's listed here, so you can see what's ahead and who the speakers are. We send out the announcements. I didn't put last night's announcements in here yet, but you all got them by email. Various logistical information. You all are here, so you obviously know how to get here. We also invite you to join in the online discussion group, which we set up on Google. There's about 56 of you signed up for that. And there's some discussion going on, and so on. And then here is where you can find the PowerPoint presentations and also the videos. So we've got the videos from last week and the week before up. I'll just show you what it looks like. When you click on that, you get this page. It's broken up into some pieces, so you just click on that and watch it, and the next one, and so on. These are all on YouTube as well. We're also uploading them into iTunes, into the Northeastern channel of iTunes, in case some of you want to do a subscription through iTunes, so it automatically gets into your iPod. And what else? The certificate of participation. Some of you have already emailed me that you're interested in doing this. It really means attending regularly, participating in the online group, and then writing a brief paper at the end, either a 2 to 4 page essay on your thoughts, your recommendations for how to improve urban communities, or a 700-word op-ed that you would write in theory to the newspaper about your thoughts on what could improve urban communities. So those are the main things. Does anyone have any questions about this? No? Okay. One more, we're experimenting with all kinds of AV things, learning. One of the things we're also doing, in addition to this video recording, we're doing this new thing called Integrity, which I'm going to start right now. What this is, it records the audio plus whatever's on the computer, meaning the PowerPoint, in case you want to listen while watching the PowerPoint. Okay. So I'm going to set that up, and then we'll bring Barry back up. Okay. Here we go. Okay, it's recording.
Thank you, John. I'm amazed. I just gave up my Selectric typewriter a few weeks ago. So what I want to do is review a little bit from last week, bring out some of the themes from last week in a little bit sharper detail. Our colleague Russ Williams is going to introduce us to the whole question of land values, and then I'm going to come back before our first hour is over and introduce the whole idea of what is happening in terms of the kind of 21st century and the things that we're talking about today. So let's go and take a look at what we very quickly looked at last week, and I called it this week From Jefferson's Rural America. 5% of people lived in cities in 1790, the first census that the United States took, to the city of America's Industrial Revolution in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. You saw this graph. I've embroidered it a little bit this week to show you the kind of pre-Civil War period, before the American Civil War, where even at the dawn of the Civil War in the 1860 census, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans lived in a city. We were a rural nation going to war. We then had this rapid period of industrialization from essentially the end of the Civil War through the beginning of World War II. Cities like Detroit that we talked about, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, Akron, Toledo, St. Louis, became powerhouses, became the most powerful cities in the country, the most powerful cities in the world, based on manufacturing. And as we're going to see, based on transportation. And then we'll see in the post-World War II period, the concentration of population continues to grow in metro areas, but we'll see at the end of today's first hour, not in central cities, at least through 2000. So, we showed you these bubble graphs, and I did hear some kind of oohs and ahs when you saw them, so just to get that reaction again, I put them up again. Here are the cities in the first graph from 1830 to 1831 census, and you'll see they're right along the East Coast. And the 2-3 cities there that are of prominence are Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and just the beginnings of this new city called Washington on the Potomac, built by George Washington. By 1870 to 1871, really at the kind of real dawn of the Industrial Revolution, you see continued concentration right along the East Coast. New York, Washington, Philadelphia, Hartford, Providence, Rhode Island, cities of Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, but the beginnings of migration and immigration into the Midwest. You see that little tiny circle there called Chicago at the base of Lake Michigan on the 5 lakes of the Great Lakes. You see the little tiny, tiny dot of Detroit, where I grew up, a city which by 1871 was really finding its place in the American manufacturing world. Not on the automobile, which of course will still be 30 to 40 years later, but Detroit would become the cast iron stove capital of America. In fact, as a kid, when I used to go to Belle Isle, this beautiful little island in the Detroit River, which is basically a big park, you would cross the bridge and they had constructed cast iron, a 3-story high cast iron stove, which was fed by wood. We were the cast iron capital for good reasons I'll mention a little bit later. If you then look at 1920 to 21, the era of the beginning of the real boom in modern manufacturing, again you see the concentration on the East Coast. You see a city like Chicago booming, becoming the new transportation corridor of the whole country. But you also see the beginning of major developments in cities like St. Louis, just southwest of that Chicago bubble, Kansas City, and then out on the West Coast, from south to north, Los Angeles, San Francisco and the Bay Area, Portland, Oregon, and that little blip just below the Canadian border, Seattle. And then, just 50 years later, look at the bottom graph. That's basically where we are today, with massive concentrations still in the East Coast, the industrial Midwest, almost nothing in most of the states, and then huge concentrations along the West Coast. But also growing dots, even by 1970, that correspond to Salt Lake City, Utah, Phoenix, Arizona, and of course Dallas, Houston, Texas, Oklahoma City, New Orleans in Louisiana, and of course the growth of Florida. On the West Coast, Tampa. On the East Coast, everything from Miami, Fort Lauderdale, down to the Keys. What an unbelievable development. And the question is, why? Why cities? And that's what we began to discuss, the rise of the 19th and 20th century city there, a beautiful landscape we have here, compliments of John Sarvey showing the Chrysler Building, if I'm not incorrect. And the point we were making last week is that what made the big difference, why cities became important, has a lot to do with economics. Yes, cities will become places of great museums, of great entertainment, of great expositions, like the 1893 exposition in Chicago, the 1934 World's Fair. But what really made cities cities was the importance of what economists call scale economies. As you get larger, average costs decline. And those that produce at lower costs survive, and those who do not go bankrupt. They fail. Where can you produce at lowest cost? And that's when we introduced what looked to be a very abstract idea of the long-run average cost curve. And what it shows, if you go from your left to the right, is that when you have a very small-scale production, the average cost of every unit you produce is going to be very high. From my Detroit days, an example would be the auto industry. If I decided today, because I was some kind of maniac, to go into the production of automobiles with a new automobile, let's call it the Tesla, an all-electric sports car, and I were to put in all of the R&D, all of the investment, have all the dies made in order to produce the body parts, create a new electric engine for this car, and then build one of them, the cost would be about $800 million. That's what it cost Mr. Tesla, the producer of the Tesla. If I produce two cars, the average cost of each one of them comes down to about $400 million, right? It's a little more than that because I need a little bit more material to produce each car, and I need a little bit more labor to assemble it. Obviously, if I produce 4 rather than 2, I'm down to $200 million a car. It's still a pretty expensive car that even people who own Bentleys cannot afford. But as I produce more and more of them, the fixed cost of the development, the engineering, and so forth gets averaged over all those units. So by the time I'm producing 400 or 500,000 Honda Accords, the unit costs are very low. It's amazing if you think about it, for those of you who own your own home and have ever refurnished your kitchen. The cost of redoing your kitchen, which does not have a 200 horsepower engine in it, a transmission, doesn't move you at 65 miles an hour in relative comfort and safety, costs about twice what your car costs, because there's one of them. But at the scale of producing 450 to 500,000 Honda Civics or Honda Accords, the average cost comes down. But what does that have to do with cities? Well, in order to get to those scale economies where you're producing in huge quantity, you need to bring together huge numbers of people to do that. The plant I worked in when I worked my way through the University of Michigan as an undergraduate was a Ford Rawsonville plant, which had 7,000 employees. We produced all the carburetors, all the alternators, and all the windshield wiper motors for every car that Ford produced in the 1960s. We even produced carburetors off of the assembly line that I worked on that we sold to American Motors, which was an automobile company in Kenosha, Wisconsin. But we had 7,000 people working in that plant, and we brought them all together. So that concentrations, bringing lots of people together, was really important. But if in fact we had very fine transportation, something like we have today, those people could live in lots of different places and get to work very cheaply. So in a case of low transportation costs, you could have people spread out all over the place, but you'd be able to quickly bring them to one location, like they do, in television science fiction. And the result will be that people could still be spread out all over, just as in a Jefferson democracy of rural America. But transportation costs were huge. The way we moved things 150 to 200 years ago was primarily by water. We used the Great Lakes to build the great cities of the Midwest. That was our transportation. We used the Erie Canal, which went 363 miles from essentially New York City up to Buffalo. And then from water we turned to rail. But even rail was very expensive. And so moving things long distance was expensive and therefore concentrating things close to each other saved the most important cost we faced in the 19th and 20th century, which was transportation costs. So the real question for the 19th and early 20th century industrialists was, how do I minimize my transport costs? If I can find a way to minimize my transport costs, I'll be able to get to the lowest part of the long-run average total cost curve. And if I can get to the lowest part of the long-run average cost curve, I will outcompete everybody else. I will be Carnegie. I will be Ford. I will be Sloan. I will be Edison, General Electric. So the question was, how do I minimize transportation costs? Well, the first thing we did is we said, well, let's take a look at one model of transportation costs. And I want to go through this a little bit because it's complicated, and maybe more complicated than first. But we really have two lines here, and then we've added them together. So I want you to, for a second, forget about the top line which says total transportation costs. Just forget about it. Pretend it doesn't, it's not there. We have two different kinds of costs that matter. One are procurement costs. How much does it cost to procure the basic materials or the product that we want to sell? Right? How much does it cost to just procure those materials? And the second cost is once I've created a product, how much does it cost to distribute that product to my customers? Okay? So let's look, first of all, at the far left part of the diagram at the resource side. At the resource site, the procurement costs in terms of transportation costs are zero. I'm at the wellhead. I'm at the mine. I'm right at the plant where the Ford Falcon is rolling off the line in 1964. Or in 1965, my God, the Ford Mustang. Okay. But the distribution costs are pretty high because that person who wants to buy that first Ford Mustang happens to be a Hollywood producer 2,600 miles away in Los Angeles. And I somehow have to get that Ford Mustang transported from the Ford Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan to California. On the other hand, if you go to the other end, the cost of getting that Mustang from the dealer to you is practically zero, right? All you have to do is get in. You got to pay for it first. They give you keys. They used to have keys in cars. And you drive it off the lot. That's it. Everywhere in between those 2 points, you get a measure of distribution costs, declining as you get closer to the customer, and procurement costs rising as you go further and further away from where the thing is produced. Now, forget that I told you about that top line. Reimagine the top line by, in this case, looking at it. What is that line? That line is actually produced out of the other two lines. It is the vertical sum of the value of distribution costs and procurement costs. So if you look at the far left, the procurement costs are zero. The distribution costs are up here at essentially point A. 0 plus A equals A. Okay? At the other end, you have zero distribution costs and you have procurement costs, which are at the high point over here. Okay? If you thought about that procurement cost line as actually just being a whole set of dots for every distance from the resource site or the market, and the same for the distribution costs, I'm adding together each dot and creating a new dot, which is called the total transportation cost line, which is just a series of dots. In this case, where you have massive procurement costs and relatively smaller distribution costs, the cheapest total transportation cost is at point A. What's an example of it? Well, I have this friend who used to be a sculptor in Florence. His name's Michelangelo. And he uses marvelous marble that comes from a distance from Florence. And he'd order his marble from the marble producers in that community. One thing they could have done is says, Michelangelo, tell us how much marble you're going to need for all the sculptures you're going to do. I hear you're doing this thing called, the David. It's really cool. And you're also doing this other phenomenal set of sculptures called the Slaves or the Prisoners. You'll see both of these, by the way, in the Accademia, the Museum of Michelangelo in Florence. Well, shipping a piece of marble the size of this room, where you didn't have rivers and you didn't have good highways, was very costly. So they would call Mr. Michelangelo or send him a message or a missive in some way and say, okay, what is the size of marble you need for this guy, the David you're making? And they would cut it down so they could fit it to just outside the size he needed. And then he did this little chipping away until he got something that is pretty amazing. Right? But the idea was, this is really expensive, so what you want to do is produce that marble and get it down to the size just large enough for him at the procurement site, because the transportation costs were stunning. Here's another one, though. And here, and I don't know why my B moves from my machine to this, but the B should be all the way over to the far right. Here's a case where the distribution costs are significantly higher in most cases than the procurement costs. And therefore, the total transportation costs are minimized by doing everything you can to minimize the distribution costs. And where do you minimize the distribution costs? At the point where the product and the customer join hands. At Kmart, at Stop and Shop, at your local barber shop. Given the transportation costs that exist, particularly if you could imagine in Michelangelo's time, you didn't want your barber to be 60 miles away. Your hairdresser needed to be close by, because your transportation costs to getting the barber were significant. And so there will be certain things that, just because of transportation costs, are going to be located in your own neighborhood. That's why the Ford Mustang was produced in Detroit, and that's why your haircut was produced, if you live in Brookline, in Brooklyn. And then we have cases in which you have to bring together several different resources in order to be able to minimize transportation costs. Now you might also ask the question, who's minimizing these costs? The answer is the producer, the industrialist, the manufacturer. They're driving this. And in this case, we have two different resources in a market, right? We could have 3, 4, 5, but I have to complicate this drawing even more. But think about the production of steel, right? Steel is going to be critical to the Industrial Revolution. Iron's too brittle. It can't be made into thin